Do you have any regrets?
Yes. It was
Why?
Because she campaigned on one thing, and then since she came in, she did exactly the opposite. And what she did was, as the opposite, was a catastrophe.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Andrew Lesh, and I'm the head of public policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question: what went wrong? Liz Truss will become the United Kingdom's shortest-serving Prime Minister after resigning on Thursday. Her tenure was defined by a rollercoaster ride of economic announcements, negative market reactions, and political hijinks. And some are now claiming that this proves the intrinsic failure of free market economics. But was there in fact more going on here? To discuss this topic, I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Andrew Lilico, who is the Executive Director and Principal of Europe Economics, a regular commentator, as well as an IEA Economics Fellow. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Nice to be here.
So I think I just want to start getting an idea in terms of what your involvement was with the Truss government. You are often listed as someone who was potentially an advisor or playing some kind of a role in the decision making or the development of government policies.
Well, I was one of the press campaigners for her during the campaign. I wrote articles about that in the Telegraph and the Spectator, and I did an IEA podcast on the merits of her relative to Rishi Sunak. And I was one of a number of economists who was sympathetic to the objective of providing increasing the long-term growth rate of the economy, and also of not enormously increasing taxes just as we went into recession. So I'm sympathetic to the economic aspect of that. And in that context, obviously I discussed these matters with other economists and anybody who thought it was relevant to ask.
Do you think it was a mistake to support Truss? Do you have any regrets?
Yes. It was.
Why?
Because she campaigned on one thing, and then since she came in, she did exactly the opposite. And what she did was, as the opposite, was a catastrophe. That's the blunt truth. The reason for backing her, the key reason for backing her, was that she was pitching herself as the pro-market option, and she was saying she wasn't going to do any kind of energy package. And this was in a context in which we'd had for a number of years, anytime anything went wrong, it was the government just chose to spend vast amounts of money through the Boris Johnson period, right up to Rishi Sunak's energy package earlier this year in response to the rising energy prices. And she was saying that she was going to depart from that, not do an energy package, which would force more of a market-based response to these events. And that seemed to be exactly the right kind of a thing, and seemed to go with a philosophy that she'd espoused for a decade and more in Parliament, and was consistent, obviously, with her long-term growth agenda. So the things that she said she wanted to do were exactly the right things. The thing was that as soon as she came into office, the very first thing she announced was that she was going to introduce the mother and father of all energy packages. Not only was she going to do that, but then she was going to do all the other things as well, which made it worse.
Yeah, let's get on to that. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that Truss very much, you could say, borrowed or signed on to a lot of free market rhetoric, the general idea that economic growth is too low, that taxes are too high, and that red tape is undermining business, and that there is a potential there for a bigger economy. Truss then came to power at the start of September, and within days, as you're saying, was announcing a 200 billion energy package, something that was criticised quite heavily by a lot of free marketeers, including my colleague Andy Mayer, who called it a middle-class welfare on steroids at the time. Why do you think they went about that particular announcement, and why wasn't necessarily the right response?
I think a couple of things. I think they felt that it was a political imperative. I think that maybe when they'd gone down the path of thinking that it was going to be, they were going to say no energy handout, maybe they'd thought that the peak energy prices were going to be, 2,500 or 3,500, and when it seemed like they might be 6,500 and it might go further, they gave up. and they decided that they couldn't sanction any of that, and so introduced the energy package. Another thing about that was that they just wanted to park. They felt like the energy package question would park the issue and let them get on with all the stuff they were interested in. They just wanted to politically make it go away, so because they didn't want to be distracted from the rest of their agenda. And I think that they frankly didn't understand the fiscal implications. I think that they thought that because it was a political imperative as they saw it, it somehow wasn't going to count in the fiscal numbers. That things which had seemed impossible as things to do, markets had forgiven over the past couple of years. So, for example, if you'd gone to 2018 and Rishi Sunak had announced anything on the scale of his package of 2020 and the amounts of money, you could well have had financial market panic at that point. But because it seemed like everybody was doing it and it was a kind of fiscal imperative, at least that was how the politicians perceived the situation, somehow markets forgave them, because it was okay to do whatever it was, 350 billion of extended expenditure and borrowing as a consequence of COVID. And they thought that their energy package was going to count in somehow the same way. The markets just wouldn't mind because it was necessary. So you'd get away with it and it wouldn't be seen as some kind of long-term thing. And I think they just didn't get it. They didn't understand what the situation was, and they didn't. There was an aspect of it that, and they were right in this much, that if they had introduced the energy package and then not done any of their tax changes or parked all of their growth boosting measures, long-term growth boosting measures for after the recession and so on, they'd have never got anywhere, because they were well behind in the polls. They were going to lose probably at the next general election unless they had a vindication strategy where they really went for it on the long-term growth measures and were seen to be vindicated by events, and that was what they were gambling on. So I understand that they felt that they couldn't do things in that way. It was just they kind of half believed, and half believing was worse than not believing at all. You either had to just do the energy package and do the kind of thing that Rishi Sunak or whatever, he would have done a much better energy package than the one that they proposed. I mean, amongst energy packages, theirs wasn't the absolute worst. You could have just nationalized the sector or something, or imposed a brutal price cap. It wasn't the very worst thing you could do, but it was, I mean, it was not that good. It was pretty bad. So it would have been better if they were going to do an energy package, they should have come up with a properly conceived one and not tried to do all the other things at the same time. But I can understand that they felt that that wasn't really an option for them, because it meant giving up on the next general election, and they weren't willing to do that.
Yeah, so then you had this massive energy package, which, as you've said, was inconsistent with what Truss had talked about. She said no handouts, and they did the mother of all handouts, and they apparently, by some reports, ignored the other work that was being done within government to do a more targeted set of measures. We then, of course, almost immediately after had the Queen's death, the suspension of all politics. And then when that was over, we had Rishi Sunak stand up and drew the growth plan. Now, I think that growth plan in many respects seemed to have a kind of a free market tinge to it. It talked a lot about supply side reforms, about regulatory issues, about reducing taxes on work and businesses. But as many of the critics have now often pointed out, well, the markets didn't much like the free market plan. What was wrong with that growth plan? Why was it received so badly? Let's think about, I suppose, first economically, but then perhaps politically as well.
I don't think there was anything that problematic about the growth plan, except that the situation was that there was about 60 billion of room for fiscal relaxation, something of that order. They announced, and the point of what Truss was trying to do of most of her short-term tax cuts were really about do it as an alternative to an energy package, how you would help the economy through in the short term. That was the point, not raising corporation tax to 25% just into the face of a recession. trying to bring forward the income tax cuts so that they're coming in just as you go into the recession, cancelling the planned NI rises, even stamp duty measures and so on. These are the kinds of things that you do to try to counter a recession. But you can't do all of those things as well as then having a massive energy package that covers the same territory. What they were doing was to try to do the things which were instead of the energy package as well. And the consequence of that was always going to be that they were going to have a massive fiscal consolidation. If they were going to spend, because the energy package wasn't going to last only a short time. I mean, they had a 2-year commitment. That meant that the energy package was going to expire in late 2024, just as the general election was going to come. Well, I mean, there was no chance of that at all. They weren't going to go into the general election and say, well, 3 weeks ago, we announced that your energy bills are going up by 4,000 quid, vote for us. And so that clearly wasn't going to happen. They were clearly going to extend it, and it was going to become open-ended and an absolutely enormous fiscal commitment. And so if they were going to do that, okay, I mean, it's a terrible policy, but from a fiscal point of view, you could get away with that if you found enough other tax rises and spending cuts and so on to balance the books. And they were planning to do that in late November. On their plan, they had this first sort of indicative phase, and then they were going to set out the details in late November. But if you were going to do it that way, what they wanted to do was to raise the long-term growth rate of the economy. And they wanted to cover some of their budgetary hole by saying, well, the budgetary hole isn't nearly as bad as it looks because we're going to get in a load of extra tax revenue anyway as the economy grows faster. So the whole situation is not nearly as bad as you think. In order to make that credible, though, they had to spell out the detail of how they were going to raise the long-term growth rate. So they needed, in between the mini budget and the actual fiscal consolidation announcements, a period in which they spelled out what their growth improving measures were. A lot of people say, well, they should have just announced all the stuff at the same time, you know, what all these tax measures and tax rises and spending cuts were going to be. But that wasn't an option, because what they'd have had to do then was to have said, we're going to raise the growth rate to 2%. Magic number 2%, or whatever it would be, 2.5%.
2.5% even, I believe.
Well, 2.5 was their target, but they could have said, I suspect what they would have done was to have said, we'll make the fiscal plans contingent on achieving 2%, right, rather than 2.5. So it's going to go up. It's going to go up to some number. We're not telling you how we get it up, but you've just got to believe us. I mean, that wouldn't have worked. The financial markets wouldn't have accepted you just saying, we're just going to make the growth rate rise and we're not going to tell you how. And because we've made the growth rate rise, that makes all the numbers work. So we don't need to raise taxes very much as spending cuts. So they didn't have any option at all but to have a gap in which they spelled out. They were supposed to have these 10 major sectoral areas where they spelled out what all the long-term growth plan was going to be. And it was going to be like, that was the main element, supposed to be the main thing about the whole Truss government. So they didn't have any choice about the timing. I think it's quite wrong to claim. But the consequence of that inevitable gap was that it was inevitable that there was going to be market turbulence. They'd set things up so they borrowed far too much, so there had to be a fiscal consolidation. They weren't going to tell anyone how it was going to work. And so, and of course, to make things worse, you then immediately have a load of opinion polls saying even when Truss has come in, she's going to lose the next general election. Well, any fiscal consolidation they were going to announce in November was going to be, well, it wasn't going to start in 2023 during the general election, wasn't going to start in 2024, during the recession, wasn't going to start in 2023 during the recession, wasn't going to start in 2024 during the run-up to the general election. So it wasn't even going to start till 2025. So now you're asking financial markets, well, you've got to put up with 200 billion of extra gap in your numbers, maybe, and it could be more on a long-term basis. We don't know what energy prices are going to do. We're not going to tell you how any of this is going to be paid for until November. When we get to November, we're going to tell you a plan that we're not going to get to implement any of because we're going to lose the next general election. So nobody's even going to tell you any credible plan that could be implemented as to how any of this is going to be paid for until 2025. Well, it's not, I mean, it's hardly any surprise that financial markets didn't particularly like that. The only way...
it seems like there's a bit of a dual problem here with sequencing, though. And you say, well, they had to do it this way. It seems like a problem with sequencing to say, we're going to do all these tax cuts. We're not going to say anything on spending for a couple months, probably, was the initial plan. And we're also not going to have an OBR forecast. But no, everything will be fine because we'll get growth, but we won't quite tell you we're going to do the growth. So it seems like they could have, alternatively, what they could have done is just said, we're just going to do the tax cuts we already announced. There's an OBR forecast here, and there's a few bits of spending cuts. Alternatively, they could have effectively done the supply side reforms first and exercise their political capital. Now, I'm doubtful that they could have done, substantial reforms on planning, because I don't think they had the political capacity, the nous, the focus to do so. So in another sense, the whole project was flawed in timing, but also flawed in its ability to execute, because they didn't necessarily have the kind of political consensus necessary. There wasn't a sense on the Tory backbenchers what we need to do now, these set of regulatory reforms. There certainly was at number 10 and within some senior ministers. But if you can't bring a parliamentary party along with you, then you're obviously not going to get the growth. You can't afford the tax cuts, and also you can't really do any spending restraint either, because no one really wants to cut spending. So you're stuck where they ended up, which was between a rock and a hard place. It was an impossible mission to try to achieve. Would they then have been, based on this logic, been wise just to be very incremental about it, just try and do what little bits and pieces they could do, rather than trying to do this big radical plan that ended up backfiring?
I mean, they didn't want to just go down quietly. If you were going to go down quietly, you'd have picked Rishi Sunak. He'd have lost you the next general election. That you'd have all kind of the people at the Times and the FT and a few people at the Guardian would have approved of you. Right? I mean, that was the choice as to whether you just kind of lost the next general election quietly, or whether you tried to actually make a difference. The Conservatives have been in government for 12 years. They'd got somewhere early on in a kind of negative sense of addressing the deficit in the early part. So they made some progress on that. But that is a kind of negative agenda. You're avoiding the economy falling off a worse cliff even than it did that they had. So they got somewhere with that. They got bullied into promising a referendum, which the government then campaigned against, including, of course, Liz Truss herself, and then lost. So they ended up with Brexit. We then have total chaos. We then have Boris Johnson gets in with a big majority and does nothing. And so it's somehow got to be 12 years and you've done nothing, and nothing positive. And they wanted to at least feel like if you were going to go out, you were going to go out having tried doing something, at least I tried. I think there was definitely a part of that sentiment, that they felt like if they were going to lose, then at least they should have left some kind of mark in the sands of history of the government, rather than this Conservative government having gone all this time and really done very little at all that the government itself had wanted to do. So yeah, maybe with the benefit of hindsight, they should have said, well, sometimes life, if life deals you lemons, then make lemonade. It's if all you can do is do a few tiny things, then do a few tiny things. And if all you can do is avoid total chaos, then avoid total chaos. And with the benefit of hindsight, it seems like that was right. The Tory MPs, as you say, turned out to have no appetite at all for any of their agenda. I suspect they wouldn't have got through anything. The obvious indication of that was them backtracking immediately on the 45p. The idea that it was somehow the market turbulence was all caused by the 45p rate, which was what everybody was saying at the start, is absolutely ludicrous. You've got hundreds of billions of energy package. You've got massive losses on QE, adding into the fiscal mix. You've got these tens of billions of other non-tax rises and tax cuts, and everybody's fixating on maybe 1.5 billion, and it might be nothing of change to the 45p rate. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. And then the Conservative backbenchers aren't willing even to implement the most minor of little tax simplifications of getting rid of this rate, which should never have been there in the first place. If you're going to have a top rate, you'd have a top rate that's only 5% higher than the higher rate. You'd have a 50% or a 60% rate or something. You're not going to have a 45p under 40p. It's ridiculous. But the Conservative MPs didn't back her at all on that. And that was indicative of what happened subsequently, is when she gave way on that, she's then given way on everything else as it's gone along. Absolutely everything, not only all the other tax measures, but basically everything else on all of the long-term reforms as well. The Conservative Party just appears not to have any appetite to change anything. Maybe they weren't elected for that in 2019. I don't know.
Although I'm still kind of persuaded of an argument that will go on the lines of they were kind of ham-fisted in their approach, and the 45p being a case study here, which is that we might say get rid of the 45p, it doesn't really raise any revenue. In fact, it might be positive revenue to get rid of it because it could increase economic activity. It's a bit useless, etc. At the same time, though, if you want to do market reforms, you need to think a little bit more politically about it, and you need to be a little bit smarter about it. And that if that's what was the trigger, not for the heavy criticism of the government, for what is, I would personally say not a particularly high priority. I don't think getting rid of the 45p thing is in my top 100 policy suggestions for the government. Maybe it's in yours, I'm not sure, but I suspect not. So then wouldn't it have been, if you want to do free market reforms, you need to be politically careful. I compare it in my mind to Margaret Thatcher, where, of course, she's now perceived as some massive radical, but of course, she spent a number of years in opposition, working up her agenda. She was relatively incremental. She knew she had a lot of opposition within her cabinet and within the parliamentary party. She obviously, the difference here is Truss didn't have the time to do all that. But if you don't act incrementally, you're going to achieve very little to nothing, as Truss has now found out.
You're right in that, but and if I were to be more kind of sympathetic to them on the point, it seems to me that the 45p measure, I had no idea they were going to do that in advance. Nobody mentioned anything to do with that. So it was obviously a big surprise. I think it was, as I say, it's a measure that I am in favour of. I wouldn't have been in my top, I don't know whether it would even been in my top 100 measures to change. I was quite surprised they would do it. I thought, and I still think, that the thing about it was that it was potentially a cleverer political measure than people grasp. Because if the Tory MPs had passed that, it would have been very much more difficult for them to not pass things which were more to the benefit of people lower down the income scale. That it was a way of kind of binding the Tory MPs in to the backbenchers in to voting for the rest of the long-term growth agenda, because once you'd agreed to cut the 45p rate, you can't then say, well, I'm not going to introduce this measure which is to the benefit of the poor people, having introduced a measure which is to the benefit of the people on over 150,000 quid. So it was almost like a kind of trap which the Conservative MPs didn't fall into, because maybe they saw it, the trap aspect of these things. And I'm being too generous, and quite possibly they didn't think that far, but it might have worked. It obviously didn't. It was obviously a catastrophe.
I think indeed that is the danger. I mean, I'm kind of just in where to next. So we're seeing a lot of comments suggesting, this is the end of free market economics. Truss tried it and failed. I think for reasons you've stated, much of what Truss did was not free market economics, and she, wasn't there long enough to have actually achieved very much. But I think the public perception of that is obviously a little bit different, or maybe not public perception, but the political class perception. What should we, I suppose, be focusing on in terms of good policies and good ideas? Is it about getting kind of back to a little bit of a longer effort to change the form of public opinion? Obviously, you can't just put someone in number 10 who has free market ideas. Not only will they be unpure, but they won't be able to achieve them if everyone else is against them. What is an alternative approach?
So I think I would suggest two things at this point. One is, I think that it seems to me that what's going to happen next is we're going to have an attempted fiscal consolidation based on raising taxes and doing almost no spending cuts. And the central lesson of the fiscal consolidation literature is that tax rises-based fiscal consolidations fail. They just make recession bigger, and then you don't cover the deficit at all. So my guess is that what's going to happen next is the Tories are going to attempt that. That's not going to work. When Labour wins the next general election, they will then have to do a fiscal consolidation that involves some spending reductions. So, and whether they will be able to implement that politically themselves, or whether they'll find it, who knows? In 2009, Peter Mandelson suggested voluntarily getting the IMF in. I mean, who knows what kind of ways the Labour Party might find to navigate the process, who else it might invite to oversee things. I mean, in 1997, as soon as they came in, to navigate the challenges of backbench pressure to keep interest rates excessively low, they made the Bank of England independent. And so it might be that they find some cunning mechanism to, as it were, force themselves into spending cuts. They've done that before, and they might find a way to do it again. So once that's kind of a thing is on the agenda, then you want to find the spending changes or the public sector reforms that facilitate those things, that help the public sector to be more efficient and to increase your growth rate. So that's one dimension. A second thing I would say is there are quite a lot of things which would improve the long-term growth rate of the economy, which aren't necessarily only things that people on the right of politics would find appealing. Labour politicians are going to find faster growth appealing as well. And so I would be anticipating now that you're going to have Labour in power for quite a while. You want to try to think of what are the kinds of measures that will help the economy to grow faster over the longer term that are going to appeal to a Labour type mindset. And that, there's no reason in principle why quite a lot of things that one would suggest shouldn't. An easy example, presumably, is some of the things on planning reform. It's by no means obvious why it's any more a conservative idea to increase house building, say, or to increase the scope for large infrastructure projects to overrule local or to get buy-in from local people than a Labour project. So quite a lot of these things would be things which you could get Labour on board with. And I would say that that's the way to go. Find a way of telling a story of how this helps their agenda, why this does the things which they want. And that would be the smart thing, I would think, for a while, because it's going to be quite a bit before you're going to get to have any Tories able to execute any of these things again.
Well, indeed, Andrew, thank you so much for joining the IEA podcast. Back to the mission of putting out good ideas and trying to persuade that the value of free markets and free institutions and free societies. Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.